Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Wagner. I'm sorry I was not able to be here all the time. I was here yesterday morning, but other work commitments didn't allow me to be here for the whole period. Also didn't allow me to be there yesterday, which I regretted, and I understand that we all have to start a bit later because it got very late yesterday evening. I should be fresher than you are, but I'm not really because of these work commitments. So let me briefly introduce the slightly changed schedule. Obviously, because we are starting a bit later, we will basically shorten all sessions. Now it's already slightly after 10 o'clock, but we'll try to keep this session to 1 hour, or indeed maybe something like 55 minutes. Then have a shorter coffee break of also 15 minutes rather than half an hour. And the following session, the last concluding session, will also be shortened by 15 minutes. For this session today, we conclude on the topic of memory, and there will be introductory statements by Gerard Delanty, first of all, as the academic coordinator of this axis, followed by Mercedes Giovinazzo's viewpoint from the stakeholder side, possibly additional comments from Jasper as we go along, and then I will try to spontaneously react to what has been said before. And we should keep in mind that the purpose of the session is to arrive at a limited number of themes to pursue in the second part of this project, the second phase of this project. With this, I give the word immediately to Gerard.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, yes, as you just said, that was the aim. In the ideal world in which, fortunately, we don't live in, we would be coming to the session, or I would be speaking at the session, having identified yesterday, shall we say, a short list of what we're calling thematic areas, which we would then narrow down later for us to focus on. We want to produce 12 thematic areas right across the three axes. I think, quite frankly, we're not in a position at this meeting, and I think not in any of the three concluding sessions, to do that, and we've already had one of those yesterday. And of course, there really wasn't enough of time after the meeting yesterday, which ended about 7 o'clock, to really refine what was said down to a short list. So what I'm going to do is two things. I hope you agree that this might be the most meaningful thing to do, given the circumstances of what I think was a fairly inconclusive discussion yesterday. I'm going to just sum up the issues that I think were discussed regarding heritage and memory at the last two sessions, the academic one, which fed into the discussion yesterday. I'm going to list, in fact, I've got about 5 on my list here, and I'm going to elaborate on them. I'll just put them on the table. You've read the papers, and most of you have been at the session yesterday and some of the previous day, so hopefully I'm not saying something that's utterly unfamiliar or bizarre. One is hopefully the idea of a transnational perspective on heritage, following from a transnational view of history itself, and that has certainly been central to the especially the first two papers, the one that I co-authored and Augusto Silva's paper, but it's I think implicit in the other papers too. And well, they were asking the question that's now hopefully familiar of what happens to heritage when it becomes transnationalized, or posing the question in a different way, what happens when we look at heritage as already transnational. A second perspective that is more present in the paper that was summarized and read out by Hamon Mais, an intercultural understanding of especially here in his paper, identity. And I think that ties into another theme that's been implicit in all papers, looking at heritage and two identities as tendentially cosmopolitan, where cosmopolitanism here means the space of the encounter, exchange, dialogue. So does heritage have the potential to become cosmopolitan? And without going into that further, one could possibly see transnationalism as a basis for a cosmopolitan conception of heritage as inclusive, as opposed to being something that is often is as exclusive. We talked a lot about narratives in different ways. From starting out with the view that identities, whether collective or individual, involve narratives, so too does heritage. And we asked, and we didn't all agree on the answer to this question, what would a new narrative of the past look like? Is it possible to reorient identities and heritage around new narratives? That was an issue that was discussed. And we discussed the problem, it's a very European problem, possibly not only European, it's the problem of unity and diversity. Basically, how should the balance be? The balance seems to be tipping in the direction of greater diversity, the recognition of diversity, leaving open the question of what unity is, or indeed if unity is no longer possible today other than in the recognition of diversity. So is it possible to reconceive of unity? And that relates to some of the other points. A rough summary of the themes from the last two sessions on heritage. Is it possible to draw any conclusions as regards new challenges? And that's where it becomes more difficult. As I said, I'm not in a position to say, this is what now we should be doing. And I would very much like to hear from you, and maybe Mercedes can collect a few comments on some additional perspectives that I've missed, or other things you want to bring to the table. But we had a very brief, all too brief discussion after the meeting, and I think we selected about 4 points that maybe narrow what I said down a little bit more. One is the problem of working with difficult heritage. We talked a lot about the dark side of the past. That in a very considerable part of the academic literature is what it's all about today, and hence that question I asked yesterday: is heritage now only to be conceived of in terms of the dark side of the past as a corrective to a highly conservative and positive vision of heritage? So looking at questions like the commemoration of histories marked by trauma, crimes against humanity, how to work with that view of heritage, especially if you want a view of heritage as inclusive. A second point we have identified is maybe a little bit more specific: contextualizing narratives, the issue of handling multiple narratives. I think one conclusion that I took from the discussion regarding narratives is that it's not really possible to find a single narrative, and we discussed how historians mostly have given up on the possibility of any single narrative of European history. It's very, very difficult to find that. And yes, it was also noted it's easier to agree on what not to do than to have agreement on what might be a new narrative. But still the question of narrative remains, and that's central to the issue of multiple narratives. A third theme is transnational heritage. I think somehow that is still on the table. And maybe we didn't discuss it so much in the second paper, but I think but we did discuss in the first session, which everyone, of course, did not attend. And it seems that a really innovative idea in current research on heritage is the argument of Michael Rothberg's great book, Multidirectional Memory. What happens when different memories interact with each other? And here of particular relevance is the interaction of memories of the Holocaust with memories of slavery, to which we could also add memories relating to the Stalinist-related crimes of humanity. These being sort of three now major European memories, and what happens when they interact as opposed to being isolated memories. So the way in which memories become entangled, and that might be a focus for fruitful future research. And we discussed, perhaps we didn't actually use the term so much, but it was implicit in much of the discussion yesterday afternoon, heritage rights, the problem of negotiating heritage rights, like rights to reframe, recover one's own history. But underlying all of that, I have a strong sense of the ambivalence of heritage, and indeed we have many different views of what heritage involves. I think that was also very much present in the discussion yesterday. I think I will conclude my brief survey at this point, and may I just ask if either Mercedes or Jasper would like to add anything to what I've said.
I have one small point. Oh, we have a question. Okay.
I was lost. Sorry if I've been really distracted. Are we supposed to choose these topics for future activities, or like
Yeah.
how do they suit each other?
It would be nice if we were in that position, but I think we're not. This was an attempt at summing up, and rather like the concluding session yesterday that Anna chaired. I think they're very similar, which in fact you were also involved in.
We don't have to choose, so they are not exclusive.
No, that's well. First of all, they're not exclusive, and I think we would be preempting discussion that should take place if we were to choose. Now, I'm simply summarising the discussion. As I said, what we should be able to do is put to you 4 or more topics that would become our thematic areas, but I think we're not quite at that point yet, but maybe that's the step in that direction is what I'm saying.
Maybe there, I think in the formal, also the plans one makes when one starts such a project, from that point of view, there should be at the end of this day, I understand, 12 main areas, 4 out of each axis. But of course, in reality, as Gerard was saying, it's never exactly like that. But I think what ideally this discussion should aim at, now after Mercedes' and Jasper's interventions, is at least provide a sense of what the main areas, the key themes are, and then this can be taken further and a program for the second phase can be developed.
I mean, the rationale is that these thematic areas emerge from discussion between the academics, but us and the academic stakeholders and the other stakeholders, and especially the other stakeholders. And it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. We've organized it in 3 steps. This is the 3rd step. But I'm not sure to what extent that process has been successful. It's difficult to see how it might have been better done, but that's where we are.
Shall we, Mercedes? Let's hear your view from the discussions of the past 2 days.
Good morning, everybody. I would pick up on what Gerard said at the very beginning, his feeling that it was an inconclusive discussion. I am not sure that it's inconclusive. It might feel as inconclusive right now today. It felt possibly inconclusive yesterday when we had Jasper, Gerard, and I not even half an hour to talk about it. But as has been said, and as I always remember, one of my ex-bosses who was an engineer always told me, trial and error, my dear, trial and error. And this is about trial and error in a way, in the sense that you move 2 steps forward, maybe a step backwards. And what we felt yesterday was that in this situation and with the input that we had gathered, it was nevertheless our responsibility to suggest to your attention 4 possible areas for further work that we, the 3 of us, understood had been put forward by the discussion or through the discussion. This is nothing more than a suggestion. What we would like is to know what you think about it. Again, in this trial and error exercise, the list, picking up also on your question, Sabrina, these are 4 areas that, again, we feel could be areas in which further research could be carried out in the framework of the project. We think that they substantiate in very few words some of the main issues that came out yesterday. We might be right, we might be wrong, they might be phrased otherwise. Maybe you have some ideas as to whether A, you consider that yes, they are interesting, that you give us leeway to go in this direction, or maybe you want to suggest other formulations. What we thought yesterday was that we would, again, say this publicly and please ask you to please, give us your feedback on this suggestion. There will be further steps for exchange. We will talk about them in the conclusive session. But right now is your feeling right now at 10 o'clock in the morning, whether this, makes sense or not.
I think Jasper had one. Oh, sorry.
I'd love to hear from Martin.
I'm just. Is this what? Yes. It's something missing for me, and I'm not sure if I can articulate it. It's there's almost an inevitably an exaggerated emphasis on change and on difference or new identities and the rights of minority groups. But there's an underlying liberal political project of being nice to everybody. And it seems to me that the continuities that are threatened by otherness and newness is a key issue. So there's something about threatened identities, identity anxiety among white working classes, for example, that are crucial. And I mean, there's a big psychological literature on how people react to a sense of threatened identity, which is basically they close ranks and hate people. There are some studies in that literature that suggest that a creative activity can diminish that sense of threat. So I think there's something about reassuring anxious identities. And there's theory work, but it would be really interesting to find case studies of attempts not to include threatened minorities, but to address the identity issues of long-standing communities who may be economically precarious and feel threatened by otherness as a sort of proxy for class issues. There's all sorts of things going on there.
Thank you. It's Lars.
Probably I didn't understand it completely, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on the difference between the second and the third point. I have a feeling with my own reflections that they are very close to one another and could maybe be one point. So just to, limit it to 3 strands, which I would already find a lot, because the potential of transnational memory and contextualizing narratives is, for me, always means that we look for the bigger picture and to cross borders in both cases. be it the stories that we tell about the history of a nation or of Europe or of a ethnic group or whatever, or the changes, like new narratives for the working class, whatever. Either you need to explain to me once more the difference between the 2 points, or maybe we can just merge them.
Do you want to respond to that? And then go to Nikos?
I take the point they could be merged and simplified. They probably address different issues when that the notional narrative is not something that's specific to the transnational question, but certainly too narrow a focus would be a nice way to bring them together.
Thanks, Ray. Nikos?
Absolutely.
This is this passage from memory, heritage, public spaces, monuments, and back and forth is incredibly complex today in the context of mobilities. And we had some very interesting discussion yesterday in our group about the challenge of multiplicities and narratives and the formations of a common public sphere in that context. And the traditional ideas of a common narrative being displaced, decentered, multiplied by the minoritization of narratives that is caused by this multiplicity effect. And this has profound implications both academically in terms of how we understand public spaces and public histories, but also in policy terms and how you set up frameworks for commissioning the construction of monuments and public spaces. And this is clearly the case here in Europe because of the complex interrelated histories which are not confined to borders, which are regional often. You know, we talked about cities having multiple narratives formed by multiple ethnicities, which are often excluded or expunged by nationalist practices. But even in a place like Australia, where the context is perhaps not as complex, it also has to confront this issue by the diasporization of the public and the mobilization of other publics through tourism, etc. So when you're building a monument today, it isn't a place where you go to in order to crystallize and create a singular narrative, but it's increasingly a space where multiple peoples from different perspectives are engaging collectively with different tools also, because through their iPhones and other things, they're also decoding and interacting the symbols and opportunities and the screens or the other visual instruments and surfaces in that environment. So memory, space, and in a sense monuments have to be radically rethought. And that's why I thought that concept of multidimensional memories is phenomenally interesting, not just in terms of how one more honestly reflects and then expresses the past, but also engages with the affective dimensions of the current modes of participation in public spaces, which I call ambient perspectives, because they're coming from multiple sources, and most of the time you can't identify a singular narrative or a linear pathway by which people are making sense of their environment.
So all that is left of unity is the zone of interaction.
That's an interesting point, yes. Because I guess that is the challenge, is that how do you construct unity out of that multiplicity? And perhaps the unity comes from the craving to be together and to make sense of the complexity, rather than the grasping of a particular narrative. Because in the past, the pedagogy of those spaces was that if you know the history, that there was emperor who conquered Y people, which led to the formation of this territory, then you feel a sense of belonging. But now perhaps the challenge isn't to sort of inform people of a specific narrative, but to enable people to engage in something that they then have in common.
Yeah.
And that's where the multidimensional,
Yeah.
I think, memory and experience
Yeah.
is profoundly interesting. And there's policy implications in terms of it's not just how you tell the histories, but how you build those spaces as well.
Thank you, Nikos.
Okay.
Could you just
Sorry.
hand the mic in front of you to Cornelia?
Is it open? Heritage has a strong economic dimension, and I ask myself, how does the economic dimension of heritage, and we speak of a heritage industry, a memory industry meanwhile, how this economic dimension goes through these four issues? It's a question and a recommendation to think more on economic aspects of the narrative of memory.
Thank you.
Noted.
Jasper?
I'll go after Gerard if he has a...
No.
I'm just thinking immediately of, let's say, sites of pain and the commercialization of sites of pain, which has been a contentious thing for Poland in particular, with Auschwitz-Birkenau. That then crosses all four of those themes in many ways. So, you're quite right. If we focus also on the economic dimension, we can pull together all of those different elements in quite cogent ways. And it also then extends out into one of our other axes on inclusion. Because who makes a living and how they make a living from the representation of heritage is a key issue, and how that changes the nature of representation is obviously a key problem as well.
It's not something discussed until now, but it's obviously something we can't neglect. Have to think more about this.
Philip, can we have the mic? Here. You get it back in a moment.
Okay, thanks. It was just a thought that occurred to me as the discussion was moving along, that what hasn't been talked about in relation to this whole area is the question of power and antagonism. I don't start from the assumption that people of goodwill are finding common spaces. I start from a different assumption, which is that there are hegemonic struggles, that there are contending claims, and that, well, you may resolve some of these questions, but you resolve them in tensions which are actually implicated in relations of power. And, I wouldn't want to see that excluded altogether, since at least that is my worldview. And I also think, in terms of explaining many of the dynamics around memory and why heritage and contending memories are important, if we leave out the politics, both big and small, we're really missing a trick. And I think I'll just leave my point there.
Thank you. Sabrina?
Mine is only a comment.
Next.
Because I've been left here by Anna as a watchdog for our axis on inclusion. So many of the things that have been said until now could also in some ways be addressed by the other axis of work pack, do you call them? The other stream.
Yes.
So maybe we can also think how they can be better addressed by this stream or by the other stream, and because they are so much on the edge of the two.
Yeah,
Just
especially these two
these last comments are very
inclusion
much,
and heritage, of course, overlap.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah. Just as I left yesterday's session a bit puzzled and confused, I feel very comfortable with the summing up that has been presented this morning, and I congratulate the authors. Nevertheless, one element which hasn't come up during the workshop, that hasn't been mentioned to my knowledge anyway, is that of religion in relation to memory in particular, and identity. In in its work, the Council of Europe, for about 10 years, in its work on the, let's say, the management of diversity in the classroom and so forth, came to identify religion as an important element that should be looked at much more in depth. This was brought also to the attention of parliamentarians, and the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe issued a recommendation in this area. Based on that, there have been 2 or 3 years of further, more precise work on the dimension of religion within intercultural education. We're not talking about religious education. We're talking about aiming at creating a certain level of literacy about religion or religions in a comparative sense, using the classroom as a protective environment, with the help with an appropriate methodology. So when I look at possible topics, I could think of the dimension of religion in intercultural education as a bit of a transversal concern that could be further investigated, touching upon memory and narratives, inclusion, unity and diversity, a little bit of everything actually. And the question for the research perhaps could be what about the transformational potential of this approach in terms of producing greater mutual understanding amongst young people and eventually deeper intercultural, a greater predisposition for intercultural dialogue. So I would be happy if something along this line could be recorded
yes, we'll
and
certainly
kept
note this
in the back of our collective mind.
Thank you. Could you just hand the mic to your ear? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't see you.
I'm sorry. And I apologize for maybe raising a question that has been answered yesterday, but it might have slipped my mind. The issue I want to raise is the level of analysis. Instead of using the word cultural memory, I like the word collective memory. Now the question is, what is collective? Is this collective on the level of nations? Is this collective on the level of diasporas? Is this collective on the level of religion? Is this collective on this level of cities? It's just a question, on which level are we, all of the above. So this is just a question and I don't have an answer.
Well, I mean, sorry, I can give an answer to that, but maybe we don't want to answer now.
Yeah, let's just.
If you want to go, just.
Sorry?
Okay, I'm more or less in this line of thinking, but I want to share something that is not totally clear to me, but I want to share anyway. In the way I read and listen, I think that we are mixing two things. One is the heritage, the other one is the memory. So the point to me here is how the heritage is managed, used, defined, whatever, and what these things impact, how these things impact on forging memories. Because the heritage itself is not a memory. And that slightly changed the way you look at the thing, because then you have to look at the another component, is the component in whose memories. And on top, for me, it implies reflecting on, let's say, if you want, the recipient of this exercise of forging memories, which is the people. So it's not just the object itself. It's what kind of relationship we as individual and collectivity have with embodiment of stories that we define as a memory, as a heritage. And I think that this dimension of the individual and collective tools that put us in relation with an embodiment is a structural part of this conversation. And I perceive it a bit missing it. And it comes for me, again, it's in association with the previous comment. This is not, I don't see as a cultural memory. It could be collective memories, and therefore also has the individual's place in the collective memories. I'm not sure I totally explain what I'm trying to...
I understand what you're saying.
Thank you, Luca. Gerard, you wanted to address some of the issues that have been raised?
I'm not sure that it would be a good idea. We might use up too much time. I'd be happy to make 2 comments on, but I'm not sure. I agree that heritage and memory are different things, and we've combined them here for the purpose of simplicity, really. But I mean, a dimension of heritage is that it involves the evaluation of the past, and it involves the selection of memories. But heritage is something that transcends specific memories, and it's more, I think, to do with the stance of the present in relation to the past, where there's an evaluation of the past. We select what we want to remember for the future. I think that's at least one dimension of the distinction.
May I, Peter?
Yes, I will come in after you.
Luca, sorry, yes? I never know if this works or not. Luca, something that you have said brings to mind that there is also, from my point of view at least, an issue regarding the 4th area of potential research, in the sense that the question of rights, human rights, cultural rights, heritage rights, why should they be limited eventually to this notion or this terminology only of heritage rights? It does relate in a way, I think, heritage, culture, memory, individual, collective. I think that when tackling the issue of rights here, what we intended was, we're thinking about the question of the normative structure of the values and principles that underlie these normative structures, frameworks. But for instance, personally, I'm not sure that we should limit it only to heritage, and we should possibly have a more comprehensive view on the term rights that encompasses also this thread. Sorry, just a
Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes. Very attentive readers of the program will have noticed that Bo Straat is not here. Unfortunately, at short notice, it became impossible for him to join us. So I'm officially now in the double role as chair and discussant, and I had wanted to let the discussion run a bit to see what I could possibly add. And maybe this is the moment to make at least 1 or 2 suggestions coming out of that debate. I think, not having followed all of the discussion, but I can see clearly how the list you have elaborated touches upon important, maybe indeed the key issues to take forward. What I've seen in addition from the discussion was a contextualizing in a slightly different sense, as mentioned here, namely bringing in shaping factors for memory, power in different forms, commercialization, political power, situations of hegemony. But also, and that is something I want to highlight more strongly, maybe that was clearest in Nikos' intervention, that the issues that are now on the table here, they all point to transformations in our understanding of heritage and memory. I put them for the moment together. I might come back to that as well. And indeed also as something that is in flux. And what one tends to forget, or what one risks to tend to forget when making these obviously very valid and pertinent observations, is that memory, but to some extent also heritage, in its more conventional way, the more time-honored way, pointed to a problem for living together. That indeed, I think, I don't know whether I understand it entirely correctly, but I think it points indeed to something like a tool or a means to enable ourselves to live together with others as a collective or as a community, in another terminology, as a polity. And the problem may be that if we focus on these aspects, they all tend to undermine this answer to a time-honored question. So then the question is, if we have lots of multiplicity and diversity, what about unity arises? Now, I think this is an issue one has to address in general, and one has to address it through these themes or others, but I think these are very good. What I want to suggest, that is really my main observation, is to avoid losing the underlying questions out of sight, that one should always try to address these questions more concretely. Now, we'll give you a short anecdote and then work for 1 minute through it. The address of my faculty in Barcelona, Faculty of Economics and Business Administration, used to be Calle Coronel Tinent Valenzuela. This in English would be something like, I don't know how military terms translate well, Colonel Lieutenant Valenzuela Street. Arriving here, I didn't know who that was, and I found out at some moment, because I was curious. Well, this street has been renamed recently. Now it's called John Maynard Keynes Street. I asked some of my colleagues who have lived, were born, grew up here in Barcelona. They didn't know who Colonel Lieutenant Valenzuela was. But so I could tell them that indeed he was a son of the local bourgeoisie, a very promising son of the local bourgeoisie who fought in the Moroccan War and died in the Moroccan War, was killed in action. Now, this is obviously it's part of heritage. No, it's there on the street signs, but it was not in memory. No one knew any longer who he was. But nevertheless, someone saw the urgency to change this. In a sense, someone was stirring up an almost non-existent memory. It's also interesting that John Maynard Keynes was chosen to replace this person because it maybe the fact that it's the address of the Faculty of Economics has something to do with that. Maybe it even makes a statement in our time where the voice of Keynes is not very easily heard. But I would see it differently. I think what happens there is also something, there is a Europeanization of memory going on. Keynes is obviously not a figure which is particularly important in Spanish or Catalan history. But at the same time, it's a slightly aseptic Europeanization, because despite the current debates about austerity politics, the name of Keynes doesn't arouse passions for most people. So I think that is a bit the underlying problem, and now I come back to these themes, because many of these, the debates in heritage and memory over the past decades in Europe, of course, we don't all work on European heritage and memory, but many of us do, so let me use that example. The underlying assumption was that these dissolution processes were dissolutions of national memory. The collectivity was the nation, and that it would lead to, importantly, is Europeanization, that we would get something like European heritage and European memory. Now, I think this is highly problematic. First of all, back to your intervention, it may simply be wrong that in this process, rather there are identity anxieties emerging, to refer to you, that there are threats to identity which impede this smooth Europeanization where everything ends up well. But there are also other issues to which I refer with this what I call the aseptic understanding of European cultural memory, namely that indeed things become smooth, and it's not only the question of difficult heritage, because that is tried to be woven into the official discourse, but also that the underlying diversity gets lost. I mean, if, for instance, when I don't think maybe it's lack of knowledge, but if one looks, for instance, at cultural, intellectual, artistic developments in East Central Europe in the first half of the 20th century, they were very important. They are taken up in separate fields of the arts and of the sciences, of philosophy, but they don't become fully part of current European cultural memory. This does not happen in the course of Europeanization. They remain neglected. Or, to take up entanglements, this Europeanization is supposed to bring the national memories within Europe together. Obviously, there are entanglements. These things are done very well with regard to Germany and France, maybe also with regard to Germany and Poland. But at the same time, a kind of a memory border around Europe is constructed where African-European entanglements, like the fact that Colonel Lieutenant Valenzuela was killed in Morocco, they get lost. So I think my main plea here is to keep these themes, which I think are very good and they have emerged from the discussions, but to be aware of the fact to treat them in concreteness against an underlying problem and against structures of, against the background of structures of hegemony in the way to address these underlying problems. This was my discussant's contributions. We have a few minutes left for further comments, including here from the panel, but maybe first other reactions from the whole meeting. Yes, please, Martin.
Again, in terms of going back to continuity, a really basic one is attachment to place. I mean, you described all these multiple narratives happening at sites, but actually, I think the death of the nation has been predicted many times and it's not happening. I think the power of cities to recruit attachment is really powerful and generally very positive and often doesn't have the negative connotations of nationalism. But any community formation, again, we exaggerate the digital community, but even diasporic communities form attachments to new places very quickly in lots of cases, and research on what is conducive to attachment to place and what forms barriers to attachment to place. I mean, things like poverty tend, but even poverty doesn't stop people forming attachments to places.
Thank you. Dean?
The idea of the anxiety of about heritage and memory, that's a very, very important point. And very certainly you imply the influx of newcomers and so on, and how to live together, so how the majority or the autochthonous population feels. But it also relates to live together with memories of others. That is what we also talked about yesterday, where it is about past populations which disappeared. And in that case, the anxiety is related to the fear of kind of revanchism. That is like in the Sudetenland, the Czechs are so stubborn about any reconciliation, although it is not expressed, but there in the feeling of the population, it is just one example. There are lots, like in Greece and Turkey and everything, that the property will be retaken or claimed. So that is another kind of Transylvania. So lots of reasons which for the Europeanization of the heritage can go ahead. And one more thing, you use the word commercialization. That's very important to the point.
This was Cornelia.
What Cornelia raised. So it is not just. So it is two things: the economic aspects of memory and heritage. That's one thing in a neutral way. That how it is done. And the other thing is the commercialization, the simplification, how it is distorted to be more marketable.
Thank you. Yes, please, Volker.
I don't want to over-exaggerate this idea, although I agree with you, of commercialization. If I look at museums in general in Europe and not only in Germany, I don't see this commercialization in the history sector. I instead see, okay, that's my opinion. I see many thoughtful leaders in museums, directors in museums who avoid this, maybe coming from Germany, having the luxury of having quite a lot of, or more funds than maybe other nations for museums, but I see more a discussion about history, a discussion about cultural heritage and memory in each of the museums, at least the ones I'm involved with. Most of them are the Jewish Museum in Berlin, or also an interesting museum, and I don't want to tell another anecdote, but I just mentioned this, the Museum of East Prussian Past. Just happens that this is in Lüneburg, in the town where I teach, and so they have a very thoughtful idea. This museum exists. Now, what to do with it today? Is this revanchism because there is still a museum of East Prussia in West Germany, not in East Germany, and how can we deal with it? And everybody I talk to has a pretty good idea how to discuss it without being revanchist. And this is a discussion, a discourse that is not at all commercial, period.
Yeah, the commercialization aspect can be a form of inclusion, because museums are now places where people just go to and
just a
do many
clarification.
things.
Just a clarification. I really had in mind, for example, fiction, films, novels. So that kind of commercialism, very, very primitive thing, the serials and the television, which distort it just to be more palatable for the masses.
Braveheart, for example.
Okay, did you want to? Okay. Maybe, I don't know whether Mercedes, Gerard, or Jasper wanted to make any kind of concluding statement.
I don't think so. I think
I have one tiny point, which is of course that the UN and its organs are interested very much in the idea of heritage rights. So it's becoming an emergent field. They have a special rapporteur on rights, Farida Shahid, and she's been specifically naming this as a key issue for the Balkans, but also for North Africa. Yeah, cultural rights. She talks of heritage rights in a speech, a couple of speeches she's made. She specifically mentioned heritage rights, the right to heritage, which is seen as opening up a space for social negotiation over the past. And I think it's starting to set a new agenda. For me, it comes also from some of the activities that have happened in museology in New Zealand, in Canada and elsewhere, where Indigenous rights have pushed this agenda to the front. But it will become an issue, I think, for minority groups and minorities within a European space. But if you've got a clarification or further depth to add, that would be great.
No, it was just that my understanding, and I'm sorry, I'm obviously late, so I missed this session, but my understanding very much of her point is to be extremely cautious of heritage and heritage rights, and the approach to heritage often as an instrument of oppression, even in the patriarchal revisioning of indigenous rights is extremely dangerous, and she's, in my knowledge, quite very, very careful with that, so that I'm just giving that caveat.
No, well, and thank you for that, because I think that perhaps emphasizes the negotiating heritage rights. It's something that practitioners will have to negotiate as demands are made over spaces, places, and museums, and you have to find your ways through it. And we think it's worth looking into that in greater depth, trying to analyze it.
Can I come back to, as a civilian here, the practical, I was thinking of it now, asking for yesterday in terms of practicality, but I could envisage as an output from all of this a series of briefing notes that practitioners could use that would address, there's a kind of matrix of issues, and then there's power, economics, place, inclusion, but key topics like current debates on heritage rights, issues to take into account when commissioning a heritage exhibition, issues to take into account when interpreting a historic place or commissioning a historic monument. You can imagine the committees that are set up to do these things, often politicians who have no background. So you would still need another layer of interpretation to brief your committee, but for a practitioner to have, a 4-page summary in plain English at the end of this process of key debates and resources that you could look to, United Nations documents or whatever, would be incredibly useful and practical.
Thank you very much.
Just quickly, I'm very much on the line of going for whatever you want to consider cultural rights or rights in general. I think the Article 27 of the Human Rights Declaration is clear and it's fundamental. And you need to have this kind of discussion inscribed in that framework. If you just narrow it down without framing in that context, you're just creating another space of discussion which is out of what has to be the political debate, and the political debate is how human rights are fulfilled. Otherwise, so you can keep it as a line of thinking which is specific, but you cannot disconnect it from the rest. This is in my view.
Yeah,
Would be a major political mistake.
May I, Peter?
On that point, yes.
Yes, on that point exactly. That's why I brought up earlier the issue that we did put up here heritage right, but to my understanding, it's possibly trying to narrow it too much, and this might be counterproductive because of two reasons. One is that the current framework that is put forward through the SDGs, and thanks also to a certain lobbying task, and also, of course, to the work of the High Representative Mrs. Farida Shahid, who is now going to be replaced. The only mention in the targets and indicators in the SDGs actually relates to heritage and nothing else. It's 11.4 if you want to see it, and that's the only mention. Culture is mentioned, on the other hand, only in the preamble. And as much as people think that that is a politically relevant mention, it is not declined afterwards in practical elements, which lead afterwards to possibly operational programs in the sector. Therefore, somehow, the battle for heritage has been already won. The battle which has not been won, and which the next High Representative will have to carry on, is the issue of cultural rights in the larger framework of human rights. And therefore, if this project can and has to actually come up with a research/policy agenda, it should be capable of justifying why the elements under scrutiny are important. And therefore, again, I think that heritage rights, it's too narrow. I fully agree with the issue of the briefing notes. They are fundamental because this sort of background should be available to all of us, because in our daily work, it is something that is absolutely relevant. And here we touch upon another issue, which was, I think, which has come up, I think, in the discussions these days. It's theory versus, let's say, concrete activism. Let me put it that way, maybe a bit too bluntly and simplified. On the one hand, we need overall arching theory, let's say major overviews on issues. On the other, we need very concrete material that we can use in daily activity.
Thank you, Mercedes. A very last intervention, and then we close
very
the
briefly
debate.
on this very point. Cultural rights is very important political and complex issues. One aspect that I think we have to keep in mind is not only the right to this and the right to that. It's the right, in this case, to know heritage, the right to know religion, the right to live existentially in the present, and this is something that is of particular concern today in the real world that Mercedes was talking about.
Thank you very much, and special thanks to Mercedes, Gerard, and Jasper. I think with this list and the debate about it, which we have had now, we have arrived at something from which we can go on. Maybe not exactly the few items which are so precise that we can take them as building blocks, but at least we have some concrete ideas as to how we go on. We should have a short break now, not more than 15 minutes, because everything is running a bit later, so we should reconvene for the session on creativity at 25 past 11. Thank you very much.
That's good.